Today, Microsoft 365's Copilot Extensibility story has finally reached the generally available milestone. Now, if you're like me, you've had a hard time keeping up with the evolution and the ebb and flow of Copilot Extensibility over the last year. So in this episode, I want to give you my take on the current state of the Extensibility story with Copilot for Microsoft 365. We're going to cover everything that was in the GA announcement, and I'm going to touch on what you can expect to come next for developers and some open issues that we're still dealing with. Hey, I'm Andrew Connell. I'm a 20+ year veteran of Microsoft's productivity ecosystem, predating Microsoft 365, and I focus on topics for full stack developers just like you. If this topic interests you, check out my free newsletter where I talk about the same kind of topics and I share the most important news in the Microsoft 365 and Microsoft Azure space for full stack developers delivered straight to your inbox, including Microsoft 365 Copilot. Okay, let's get started. But as you watch this episode, if you have a question, drop it in the comments below. Microsoft is very interested to hear your feedback and your questions. I'll take these back to Microsoft, and when I do my next podcast with Jeremy Thake, who owns the entire developer experience for the Microsoft 365 Copilot Extensibility story, when we do our next podcast episode together on his Microsoft 365 developer podcast, and we'll address anything that was unclear from these different announcements. Let's dive into a brief history of Copilot Extensibility and Microsoft 365. In November of 2023 at the Ignite conference in Seattle, Microsoft announced Copilot Studio, and they introduced the first pieces of their developer story for Copilot for Microsoft 365. This included enhanced Microsoft Teams message extensions, also referred to as ME extensions, with additional properties allowing them to become Copilot plugins for fetching real-time data when Copilot deduced a matching user's intent from their prompt to what the ME plugin could provide. And then in May of 2024 at the Build conference in Seattle, Microsoft unveiled the entire Copilot Extensibility story. And this covered Microsoft Teams ME extensions that were currently in preview, the OpenAPI plugins, which were not yet available at the time of the announcement in May, Declarative Copilots, which were at that time in preview, and Custom Engine Copilots, which actually were generally available back at the Build conference. The entire Copilot Extensibility story was well covered in one big breakout session, BRK 150, the Developer's Guide to Customizing Microsoft Copilot. Now you can learn more about all the news and all the updates for Microsoft 365 full stack developers, including the Copilot news from the Build 2024 in my article, the Microsoft 365 Full Stack Developers Recap to Build 2024. I'll include a link for that as you see here, as well as in the description under the video. Then, in September of 2024, at the Copilot Wave 2 announcement virtual event, Microsoft introduced some new features for Copilot in various Office applications like Word, Excel, Outlook, and a couple other options. For the developer story, though, they rebranded the Copilot Extensions story, which was kind of the all-encompassing term for everything you could do to extend Copilot. They renamed that to Copilot Agents as the new overarching term. Now, this meant that Declarative Copilots became Declarative Agents, Custom Engine Copilots became Custom Engine Agents. However, the Wave 2 event, it provided very little information for developers beyond this renaming. And frankly, it was a little hard to follow because they acted like everyone knew what this stuff was ahead of time. And this whole agents thing kind of came out of the blue, and it looked like it was something new when it was really just a rebranding, a renaming of things. That's what I'm going to try and address in this episode that I'm going to unpack everything. Now, before we dive into the details from today's GA announcements, the main points from the today's GA announcement is as follows. Copilot Agents is now the umbrella term replacing Copilot Extensions. BizChat is the new name for Copilot for Microsoft 365. This is also going to be known as Microsoft 365 Copilot or M365 Copilot. This whole concept of Copilot for Microsoft 365, that's essentially been retired. So the new name that we call it is BizChat, and we can also call it Microsoft 365 Copilot or M365 Copilot. We also have these things called Declarative Agents or DAs. These are now generally available in Microsoft Teams in that right-hand rail experience. We also have Custom Engine Agents. or CEAs. These are generally available when they're published to Microsoft Teams. And we also have Open API plugins, or just API plugins for short. These are also generally available only for declarative agents. Now, these add to the extensibility parts that the Copilot Story and Microsoft 365 that were already generally available, like Copilot Studio, which has been GA since August of 2024, and Microsoft Graph Connectors. Those have been GA for quite some time. So now let's start to dive a little bit deeper into each one of these different announcements now that I've kind of explained a summary of what they've done. Let's start out with why did Microsoft rename so many things in this GA announcement? Well, they noticed that the industry was really trending towards calling custom AI solutions agents. And initially, Microsoft was a little cautious about using that term because their offerings weren't really fully agentful, or having the ability to act like agents. Or they really didn't have the ability to act on behalf of us automatically. While it was something that they were working on in the future, however, they ultimately decided to adopt the agent terminology to avoid future renaming. And I can appreciate that. Probably some other longtime Microsoft 365 developers are also going to appreciate that because they're familiar with some of these naming inconsistencies. All of those that are out there and built Microsoft Teams apps, you know how we have a tab and a personal app? In the manifest, in the app manifest, it's called a static tab. And while a channel tab is also called a configurable tab in the manifest. That's all because when they originally created these things, they gave it one name and then ultimately they came up with a different name, but it's still like that in the code. What about you people in SharePoint world? You remember sites and site collections? You go back as far as I do, those things were referred as SP webs and SP sites respectively as well. By renaming everything at the GA milestone, Microsoft aims to avoid some of this confusion and some of this mess. In fact, these new names are consistent across the documentation, user experience, code, and all the manifests at GA. They went back and did a whole string replacement on everything. They don't like the fact that I just call it a string replacement. There's a lot more work involved, but that's effectively what they did. Now, the first term I want you to be aware of is this term Copilot Agents. I want you to consider this the overarching term for all Copilot extensibility that's replacing what we used to call Copilot extensions. Copilot extensions, that was the term that was heavily used at the Microsoft Build conference back in May of 2024. Now, the next one is BizChat. This was formerly known as Copilot for Microsoft 365, and it's also known as Microsoft 365 Copilot or M365 Copilot. BizChat is that chat experience that leverages data from Microsoft 365, and it's available across various Microsoft 365 experiences, including Microsoft Teams, all of the Office apps, and the chat experience that you can find at office.com/chat. When you send a prompt to BizChat, what it's doing is drawing from two knowledge sources. It's large language model training or LLM training that's similar to what you get when you use ChatGPT from OpenAI. It also, the second data point that it gets or knowledge source that it has is access to all of your data within your Microsoft 365 tenant. Documents and SharePoint libraries, stuff inside your calendar, your meetings, etc. That's what's going to set it apart from all the other AI chatbots that are available on the market. It has access to your M365 tenant. Now, this combination allows BizChat to provide unique and personalized responses based on your organization's information. While BizChat offers a great out-of-the-box experience, customers wanted to extend its capabilities with additional data sources, and this would enhance its knowledge and make it more useful for different organizations. So let's explore this Copilot extensibility story and what's covered by the October 2024 GA announcement. The first extensibility option is Microsoft Graph Connectors. These have been generally available for quite some time. Microsoft Graph Connectors enable customers to upload unstructured content to Microsoft Graph, which then indexes and vectorizes the content for use with a LLM. For example, like manuals, standard operating procedures, or documentation, that's an example of unstructured content. It's really ideal to use content that you're going to be in your Graph Connector that doesn't change very frequently, right? So you want content because it's got to be indexed ahead of time, so you have like this little bit of a delay when you go to update it. What these Graph Connectors do is they add this third knowledge source to Copilot, in addition to the LLM training and the data that it already has in your Microsoft 365 tenant. Copilot can now use this data provided by Microsoft Graph connectors to expand on its knowledge beyond those other two sources that I previously mentioned. All of the content uploaded through Microsoft Graph connectors is also available within the mainline BizChat experience. This effectively serves as a third knowledge source for Copilot. Now, the next extensibility option that we have with Copilot is a plugin. Now, in Copilot, developers can give plugins or create plugins that allow Copilot to implement the Retrieval Augmented Generation pattern, RAG pattern. What this does is this allows us to fetch some structured real-time data that Copilot can use to enhance its response. Copilot can then deduce from the user's intent which plugins it can use to gather additional information when the user submits their prompt. So for example, I just talked about how Microsoft Graph connectors allows you to go submit a bunch of content and add that third bubble or that third blob of knowledge for Copilot. That has to be done ahead of time. And it's a way for us to kind of ground our Copilot, our prompts with more information that is more context specific about our domain. What a Copilot plugin is going to allow us to do is to then on the fly get real-time data and add a fourth knowledge bubble of more real-time data because all those other sources aren't as real-time. Now, there are two types of plugins that exist today. There's a Microsoft Teams message extension plugin or an ME plugin. Those were announced at Ignite of 2023, and they have been previewed since that time. Now, these plugins are also still in preview today. Just want to be clear of that. I'm going to talk more about these though, and a little bit later in this episode. The second kind of a plugin is an Open API plugin, otherwise known as just an API plugin. I keep screwing up and calling them Open AI plugins when they're really Open API plugins. Really what this is a description of some sort of an endpoint or some API. You might be familiar with the predecessor to Open API, which is Swagger. Now, these were announced at Build 2024, but they were not yet available. API plugins, though, are now generally available in the Copilot experience if they're included within a declarative agent. That's the only way we can use them today as of GA. Also, as part of the GA announcement, we previously had the ability to use plugins by mentioning them in the main business chat experience. But these now belong as part of a declarative agent. You can no longer mention them like we saw prior to the Wave 2 announcements back in September of 2024, or in any of those demos that we saw from Microsoft Build back in May of 2024. Now, another part of today's announcement includes the GA of Declarative Agents, which we used to call Declarative Copilots. Now, under the hood, what a declarative agent does is it runs on the BizChat stack. And this allows them to leverage the three knowledge sources that I previously mentioned, the LLM training, your Microsoft 365 tenant content, and content from your Microsoft Graph connectors, and your fourth knowledge source, which are plugins. It also leverages Microsoft models and the Microsoft Orchestrator. Now, you're going to see declarative agents in the right-hand rail of your Microsoft Teams experience if you have a Microsoft 365 Copilot license. Those licenses used to be called Copilot for Microsoft 365, but now they're called Microsoft 365 Copilot licenses. Now, you can also mention these guys in various Copilot experiences, including the Office clients and the chat experience at office.com/chat. Now, declarative agents, as I said a minute ago, they can also include plugins, but they're currently limited to just the API plugins. The Microsoft Teams ME plugins are not supported in declarative agents at GA. Microsoft is working on addressing the investments the developers made during the message extensions preview. Now, Microsoft's official recommendation is to create API plugins, not ME plugins. Why? Well, during the public and the private preview period over the last year, customers and Microsoft found that by simply adding a message extension plugin to what we now call BizChat, it didn't work as well as it was expected or really build. Developers had to invest a lot more work to train a Copilot and to effectively use and call their message extension plugins, as the orchestrator really couldn't pick up them and extract properties and map them to the inputs on those ME plugins as easily as it was anticipated they would do. Most customers in the private preview actually requested a way to directly call APIs, and that's why the API-based plugins became the more preferred option. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these ME plugins, though, if you've already built these, and their future later in this episode, so stay with me. Now, the next thing we'll talk about are custom engine agents. These were formerly called custom engine copilots. These are GA when they're published to Microsoft Teams as of October 2024. However, they're not yet generally available in BizChat. Now, these agents are going to allow developers to implement their own Copilot using any AI stack, such as using their own models, their own finely tuned models, or their own training they've defined, their own orchestrators, even their own platforms. For example, developers could leverage the Teams AI library. You could leverage Copilot Studio, or you could use models from Hugging Face, Meta, otherwise known as Facebook, Google Gemini, Amazon Web Services, or other sources. The key advantage, though, of custom engine agents is that developers have full control over the model and the orchestrator. For example, they can perform their own fine-tuning of their own models, but it's worth noting that declarative agents also offer a significant customization options through the developer-defined instructions. So what is not yet GA or in preview for custom engine agents? Well, Microsoft is currently working on enabling handoff from a plugin to a custom engine agent. In the future, custom engine agents, they'll appear in that right-hand rail of Microsoft Teams' experience, just like declarative agents. Users won't be able to really distinguish between a declarative agent and a custom engine agent, which is kind of what we want for our end user experience. And they'll also have the ability to mention custom engine agents just like they do with declarative agents. And when I say mention, I mean like mention them. Now, I just mentioned handoff. You might recall that the handoff feature was demonstrated at Build 2024. And what this did is this feature allowed us to transition from an immersive chat experience from like BizChat, as we call it today, over to our own custom engine agent. However, with the recent investments in custom engine agents, such as the ability to mention them and to list them in the right-hand rail, handoff is no longer going to be necessary. So in other words, you can think of handoff as kind of like a stopgap option for now until custom engine agents can be pinned in that right-hand rail experience and mentioned. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Copilot Studio has been generally available since August of 2024. Now, before today's Copilot Extensibility GA announcement, you could create actions in Copilot Studio. And these actions could be prompts that using the AI prompt action or conversational plugins or REST API plugins. But this approach is no longer available. With today's GA announcement in October of 2024, you now build agents in Copilot Studio. You can add different action types to these agents, such as the AI prompt action, conversational plugins, or API plugins. And you can then publish the agent to BizChat. And additionally, you can create an API plugin in Copilot Studio. We call that the REST API action. Now, while it was not part of the GA announcement, it's worth calling out this thing called the Agent Builder that was shown during the Wave 2 announcements in September. There's something I want to call out about it. When you're inside of the Office.com chat experience or the Microsoft Teams experience where declarative agents are listed, you're going to find this new Create Agent link alongside those other agents. This Create Agent link is going to give the users a little mini Copilot Studio experience where the user can then provide some instructions, maybe select SharePoint knowledge sites or file from a specific site or specific files, maybe pick some Microsoft Graph connectors that they've previously created. And then as the user, you can publish it yourself, or you can use this share link to share the agent you've created with others. Now, this raises the question, why would I use Copilot Studio or Microsoft Teams Toolkit to build a declarative agent if I can just use this agent builder thing right inside of Teams or inside the office.com/chat experience? Well, one really big limitation to the agent builder is that it can't take advantage of API-based plugins or any other actions that require calling a custom API or an external API. These more complex tasks, they remain in the realm of developers and are not available through the agent builder. This episode has covered the general availability announcements for Copilot Extensibility, but I want to highlight a few upcoming developments in this area that you can look forward to. Now, during the preview period, many customers created ME plugins for use within Microsoft Teams and Outlook. They were following the guidance that Microsoft provided on how to make them available as plugins for Copilot. You might have seen that the semantic description on both the description and the actual parameters that we can pass in. And that we used that guidance to make these ME plugins available, or ME extensions and plugins available for Copilot for Microsoft 365, which we now call BizChat. But as I mentioned earlier, they're not available for use within declarative agents at GA. But don't worry, Microsoft isn't leaving us hanging. Microsoft is actively working on options for developers to bring these ME extension plugin investments forward for use within Copilot Agents. They're working with a lot of customers already on this to figure out what the best story is going to be here. Now, one of the key insights that Microsoft gained during the public and the private preview over the last year is that most organizations don't have open API documents, which were formerly known as Swagger files, for their APIs, or the existing open API documents. They often aren't well suited for use with LLMs. See, these LLMs struggle to interpret and utilize the information on these open API documents effectively. What's really needed in open API docs and specifications are clear, detailed descriptions for the various endpoints and their parameters. And these descriptions help guide and train the LLM on what the API can do and how to use it properly. So Microsoft recognized this challenge. And so they're working on streamlining this process through an improved developer experience in VS Code. So stay tuned for some enhancements coming in this area. That's the next thing we're going to be watching for, in addition to the guidance around how to deal with these ME plugins we've deployed. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this episode. All of the links and resources that I mentioned throughout this episode, they're linked in the video description or the show notes, depending on if you're watching or listening to this. And if you're listening to this on a podcast platform, please do me a favor and leave me a review on the podcast app. It helps me reach other people and helps them discover this podcast. Or if you're watching this on YouTube, give me a thumbs up to help me help others discover the channel. What do you think about the Microsoft 365 Copilot announcement? Got a question, comment, or insights about it? Drop a comment in the below the video. And please do hit that subscribe button if you aren't already subscribed to the channel, so that you can see when I publish more videos for full stack developers on the Microsoft 365 ecosystem. That's all for today. Thanks. I'll see you next time.